Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anjali, and I'll be your Freestone moderator for today's event. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We'll be answering your questions at the end of the session today. We encourage you to type and submit your questions during the presentation. To do so, click on the Q&A tab of your screen, and then click the Submit button to send in your question. To download a copy of today's presentation, navigate to the Materials tab. This session is being recorded for you to review and for others that could not attend today's live event. We will be sending a follow-up email with the recording and slide deck. Please note this session has a live real-time captions tab available for you. It is in the bottom left panel of your screen. If you need assistance at any time, click on the Help tab for our support team's contact information. Great, I think we're ready to begin. Today's FRAC webinar is titled The Farm Bill, What's at Stake for Gender and Racial Justice? Now it's my pleasure to pass the floor over to Alyssa Schmier, Vice President of Government Affairs at Moms Rising. Alyssa, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining National Women's Law Center, Moms Rising, FRAC, and UNIDOS US for today's webinar. SNAP is our nation's bedrock nutrition and anti-hunger program, helping millions of women, LGBTQ people, and their families around the country to put food on the table and promoting health by supporting families and affording a nutritious diet. Recent data on participation show that women, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, and people with disabilities were more likely to participate in SNAP. The program not only promotes better nutrition and reduces food insecurity, it also frees up money for those struggling to make ends meet to spend on other necessary costs like medical care, child care, and housing. On today's webinar, you'll hear from a fabulous panel of experts exactly why the upcoming Farm Bill debate is crucial to racial and gender justice and ways you can engage and take action on this issue. First, you will hear from our panel, and then we will save time for Q&A. If you have questions, you can drop them into the Q&A or the chat box at any time, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So our first speaker originally was going to be Gina Plata-Nino from FRAC, but she is encountering a little bit of technical difficulty. So I'm going to very quickly give you Farm Bill 101, like the what is it? And then we're going to go to Amila, and then we'll go back to Gina when she's able to join. So for those of you that are not familiar, the Farm Bill is a massive, huge piece of legislation that governs an array of agriculture and food programs. It provides an opportunity for policymakers in Congress to comprehensively and periodically address agriculture and food issues. And this usually happens every 4 to 5 years, but for anyone who's done a Farm Bill before, they know that sometimes that stretches out longer. So the Farm Bill includes everything from what crops are grown to aid to small farms to nutrition assistance like SNAP, also known as food stamps. SNAP is in the nutrition title, which is Title 4. You'll also hear later from Whitney about a new opportunity for childcare in rural communities, which will appear in another title within the Farm Bill. So hopefully that is just like a brief 101. I'm going to pass it now to Amila Fatima at UNIDOS US to start in on why the Farm Bill matters.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. I think everyone can hear me and see my slides okay, right?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So like Alyssa mentioned, my name is Amila Fatima, and I lead UNIDOS US's food policy efforts. And a little bit about us and UNIDOS. We're the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. And today I want to go a little bit more into how food insecurity first and foremost impacts communities of color disproportionately, and the Farm Bill's role in addressing these racial inequities that we see in hunger. And to start off, I'll set the scene for where we are with rates of poverty and hunger. So earlier this week, the Census Bureau released data on poverty, income, and health insurance for 2022. And what it showed was that poverty increased and people of color continue to be disproportionately burdened by higher rates of poverty. The overall poverty rate and child poverty rate grew for all groups of people, but Black and Latino children continued to experience disproportionately high poverty rates at 17.8% and 19.5% respectively. These rates are more than double that of our white children. And non-citizens also experience disproportionately high rates of poverty, with a poverty rate more than twice that of the native-born population. And importantly, this data does not account for the unwinding of pandemic-era stepped-up benefits, meaning that the rates of poverty and food insecurity that we're seeing here, or that we're seeing right now, are even higher than what we're seeing right here. And on top of experiencing poverty at high rates, our communities of color are suffering from skyrocketing rates of food insecurity. During the pandemic, Congress passed legislation to increase SNAP benefits, known as SNAP emergency allotments. But those benefits expired in March, and the need for food assistance has exploded since then. According to the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey data from just last month, food insufficiency, or the condition of sometimes or often not having enough to eat, continues to be over twice as high for Black and Latino households with children compared to white households with children. And Congress has an important role to play in reversing the country's increasingly harmful hardships like poverty and hunger on communities of color, and has a critical window of opportunity with this year's Farm Bill reauthorization to do so. But rather than addressing this crisis, Republicans have used the debt ceiling negotiations earlier this summer to actually cut SNAP benefits. And now, some Republicans are trying to cut SNAP again in the Farm Bill reauthorization. So before we dig a little bit into some of the racist roots of work reporting requirements or time limits, it's important for you all to hear a quick recap of what happened to SNAP as a part of the debt ceiling deal earlier this summer. In June of this year, President Biden signed a debt limit deal known as the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. And part of this deal included an expansion of work reporting requirements for people applying for SNAP benefits. Previously, most childless adults aged 18 to 49 could only receive benefits for 3 months in a 3-year period. Groups are subject to these time limits unless they can document that they're working or participating in a job training program for 20 hours a week, or they can prove that they qualify for an exemption. But the debt ceiling agreement changed some of this. So while the agreement included some improvements to SNAP by providing work reporting requirement exemptions for people experiencing things like homelessness, or maybe they're veterans and former foster youth, the bill also expanded work requirements to people aged 18 to 54 years old. So this deal is essentially taking food away from large numbers of people, including people who experience significant barriers to employment, including many people of color who are working but experience hurdles to providing proof of employment. According to estimates from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, almost 750,000 older adults aged 50 to 54 would be newly subject to SNAP's work reporting requirements as a part of the debt ceiling deal and are at risk of losing their benefits under this bill. And nearly half of those who would be newly at risk of losing SNAP are women. And yet, as low-income families struggle to put food on the table with the end of SNAP emergency allotments and rising food costs, and even after Congress already expanded work reporting requirements for SNAP as a part of the debt ceiling deal, like I said, some Republicans are pushing for an even larger expansion of these harmful work reporting requirements in this year's Farm Bill reauthorization, as well as trying to advance other harmful proposals that would limit access to SNAP. And so it's really important for us to understand what the evidence actually repeatedly shows, and that's that SNAP helps lift people out of poverty and food insecurity, while work reporting requirements do not. Instead, these requirements or time limits deepen racial disparities in food insecurity and poverty by removing people from the program through sanctions and deterring others from applying for these benefits. The evidence also shows that with SNAP's participation already subject to strict work documentation requirements, there's increasing evidence that work requirements just increase economic hardship and food insecurity without improving employment or wages. What the research and experience also show is that most SNAP participants already work, but they have poverty-level incomes from poorly paying jobs and experience barriers to reporting adequate work hours. Additional work requirements just add needless and burdensome paperwork for both families and administrators. And these policies are really rooted in a deep and long-standing history of racially motivated arguments against federal benefits that suggest that our most vulnerable populations in the U.S. are undeserving. Given our nation's history of racism and discrimination, people of color and lower income people are far more likely to be harmed by paperwork burdens. And evidence shows that, for example, Latinos have one of the highest labor force participation rates of any racial or ethnic group in the US, yet they're concentrated in low-wage jobs and are the least likely to have access to benefits that are traditionally associated with working, such as paid sick leave. And so imposing additional barriers to participation on people who can't demonstrate that they comply with work requirements punishes them for the economic, racial, and gender inequities throughout the labor market, and also ignores the pervasive bias and hiring discrimination that we're also seeing in the labor market. These work reporting requirement proposals also rest on a disproven assumption that poor people will only work if they're forced to do so. Millions of lower income people and families work low-wage jobs that offer unpredictable hours, or they might not receive enough paid hours of work despite wanting them, or they work for employers who refuse to provide them with proof of employment or hours. These requirements merely mean that eligible families can lose access to their benefits even if they're working due to hardships documenting enough hours, challenges navigating verification systems, or maybe a failure to apply the right exemptions. We know that verifying employment is already burdensome for low-income workers, and many Latino SNAP participants have reported difficulties documenting their hours. These barriers are in part, what we've heard, due to people of color's reduced access to resources that are necessary in order to make things like verification appointments. They have lower rates of digital literacy and can't navigate these verification systems. Maybe they have reduced access to broadband, and limited access to transportation that they might need for in-person appointments. All of these barriers compound and can lead to families wrongly losing benefits that they're eligible for, and they can exacerbate non-participation in SNAP. So right now is the time for us to be working on increasing access to healthy and affordable foods and not turning our backs on vulnerable populations. And there's a number of ways that we can do just that. So as Congress negotiates the 2023 Farm Bill, I know that all of us on the call are really dedicated to protecting and strengthening SNAP and improving equitable access to healthy and affordable food for all Americans. And with that, some of Unidos US's priorities to extend equitable access to SNAP and food access are opposing proposals to impose additional work documentation requirements or slash funding for SNAP, ending discrimination against American citizens who live in Puerto Rico by creating a path for Puerto Rico's transition from the Nutrition Assistance Program, or NAP, to SNAP, helping millions of immigrants who are lawfully present and their families get the nutritious food and economic security that every family needs to thrive by lifting the 5-year bar on SNAP, and last but not least, ensuring that college students with low incomes don't have to choose between their education and eating by expanding SNAP eligibility to college students. And I'll close with a list of resources that Unidos US has put together in support of our Farm Bill advocacy, and I'll drop a link in the chat, and I'm sure we'll share these in a follow-up to the webinar. But thank you all so much, and I'll pass it back to Alyssa or Gina.
Thank you so much. So Gina is actually on now, which is fabulous. So Gina will be joining us now to do her piece on kind of Farm Bill 101 and why SNAP matters. So Gina Platanino from Food Research and Action Center.
Thank you, Alyssa. So great to see everyone today. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you caring about this particular issue at a pivotal time as we're hearing what's going on in Congress. I may go a little bit fast in our slides since my wonderful colleagues already covered most of this information. But like Alyssa said, we are going to have time at the end. So if you have additional questions, feel free to ask. We will be sharing this as a PDF. Which is why many of these slides have a lot of information so that you can utilize it. As Alyssa said, my name is Gina Platanino, and I am the SNAP Deputy Director at the Food Research and Action Center, and we are a national organization that works on tackling the food poverty-related sources, and we are working to eliminate hunger in the U.S. Umaila did a wonderful job talking about what the poverty rates are across racial panels. And it's important for us to know that when it comes to this particular groups, yes, by race, there are higher increase. And on top of that, depending on how you identify in your gender as a female, you also have a higher percentage of rate of poverty. The 22 report of supplemental poverty measure, we saw that there was a 60% increase in poverty from 7.8% to 12.4% in 2022. We also saw a child poverty rose more than doubling. And unfortunately, our Native Americans and Alaska Natives had the highest poverty rate compared to other racial and ethnic groups. And I utilize those terms because that's what the terms that SPM utilizes, not the terms that are sometimes appropriate. I just want to acknowledge that. And we also saw that there was a 4.9% increase in poverty from 7.9 to 12.8. And part of the reason as we think about this is a lot of the reasons that Umaila already talked about. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened. Umaila touched on this a bit, right? We have this hunger cliff that we have been experiencing, that we have been talking about for a while. And part of the reason was that in March, it was the end of the emergency allotments, and many individuals went from $281 to $23. But nothing else changed, right? Shelter costs kept going up, childcare, especially for women, kept going up. But this benefit that had helped many individuals to be able to purchase the food that they need for their families was cut down dramatically. And we saw that across the country. Individual states lost, this additional funding in terms of the money they were getting in addition to their regular SNAP benefits. If you take out a state of like Alabama, they lost over $67 million a month that they were utilizing for individuals who have food resources. DC over 13 million, California over 520 million. So that is a huge gap that our wonderful food banks have been trying to meet, but they can't do it all. This is why SNAP is so important. We know that our friends at Propel have been doing a lot of surveys and have shown us that many individuals who are on SNAP are really lagging behind utility bills. And we see that many of them have not been able to pay their rent in full or did not pay their utility bills in full since the end of emergency allotments. And there's also a growing financial insecurity, as we can see in the increase as we keep getting away from when people were having these emergency allotments. And we also have something to contend, which is the end of the public health emergency. And like Umaila said, the beginning of time limits for individuals and for college students. So it's just a lot for individuals to be dealing with right now. And so why are you here, right? Because there is a tool right now. And it's called the Farm Bill, where there's an opportunity to do something about these injustices and inequities to be able to address these issues. So as Alyssa said, it's supposed to pass every 5 years. In some years, like we're experiencing now, when there's contention and a lot of things going on, it might take a little bit longer. There are different sections. There's a couple of titles, and I know some of my colleagues are going to go over some of those titles. But for me, and what I'm talking about and what I'm an expert in is Title IV, which is the nutrition title, which covers SNAP and other nutrition programs. And I created, and our wonderful Tina Frag created this great little graphic that I think it's important for those who think like, what is going on? So what's supposed to happen is that what happened in January is that we had Senate and House Agriculture committees that were established. Then we had the president's budget and the budget deliberation and the debt ceiling, which was what Umaila was talking about. And we've been having Farm Bill hearings, and by this time, we were supposed to having conference committees, and in about 2 weeks, we were supposed to have a Farm Bill. Obviously, that's not happening, but that's sort of the trajectory. So we do have to wait. We'll see what is happening, particularly with ag appropriations going on and a tentative shutdown. But what's supposed to happen is the House drafts bill language, passes theirs and the Senate, and then they merge it in, and then the president signs a Farm Bill that will work. So we still have time for advocacy. We have time to really tackle these issues that are affecting millions of individuals. And one of the programs that we talked about is SNAP, right? It's our nation's first line of defense against hunger. Is the biggest part of the Farm Bill. It's the biggest chunk. In January, it helped over 42.1 million individuals put food on the table, right? It delivers assistance, helps keep vulnerable populations, reduces hunger, improves dietary intake, lifts millions of people out of poverty. We know that in 2019, from October to February, women were more than 6 in 10 of adult SNAP recipients. About 1 in 3 non-older adult SNAP recipients was a woman of color. We know that in June 2020, over 6 in 10 of SNAP households with children were headed by a single adult, which 92% of those which were headed by women. And we know that in 2020, 29% of LGBTQ women and 20% of non-binary genderqueer individuals reported that they or their partner or children received SNAP benefits in the past year. This number is a little bit more difficult to tabulate because there's no options in the way that FNS tracks the data. So it's difficult, but important to highlight that there needs to be better tracking systems. And we also know that in 2015, SNAP served over 11 million people with disabilities. So we know this program is incredibly important for particular populations who have been historically marginalized. And when we think about just the wonderful work that our food banks have been doing because of the end of emergency allotment, we know that for every meal that the Feeding America Food Bank provides, SNAP provides 9. Right? And it goes directly into the local economy. In a downturn economy, this translates into $1.50 to $1.70 in terms of resources. And we also know that economists have estimated that as a result of the end of the emergency allotments, that grocers lost about $20 billion worth of profits this year. We know that across the country, various states redeem SNAP benefits and also brings millions of dollars into their local economy. We know that SNAP produces 12% of grocery sales and almost $2 billion in federal, state, and local taxes, creates over 200,000 jobs and 6.7 billion wages. And you may be wondering, why does this matter and why we're talking about it? Because as we're talking about why the Farm Bill is so significant and why we need to protect and strengthen SNAP, is because of everything that it does, the human impact, the economic impact, the health impact, and the long-term impact for our communities. I also just want to acknowledge that while SNAP is an incredible program, that there are other programs that are not part of the Farm Bill that have a deep impact for women, for LGBTQI plus communities, and that you can find more information on this slide, which you will get, really breaking it down because it has to be a holistic approach: housing, childcare, other programs that really are needed to alleviate and eradicate poverty. So again, our goal in terms of our Farm Bill this year is really to protect and strengthen benefit adequacy, not going back on, really highlighting some of the data points we just made, that individuals have been struggling, that they are hungry and things have not improved. And reminding that Farm Bill enactment per se is not the goal, because unlike other programs, SNAP is permanently authorized. So that gives us a little bit more of a buffer in terms that it's better to have a very strong Farm Bill than a very negative one, because this has long-term consequences. And that we really have to advocate for the best implementation of the SNAP policies post the debt limit changes that Umaila really talked about. So how can we do that? There are a couple of opportunities that we wanted to highlight that are in the Farm Bill for individuals to really address. There's a particular introduction of S1336, which really talks about SNAP adequacy, streamlining SNAP standard access medical deductions, and eliminating the cap on excess shelter deduction. And I wanted to talk about that briefly. The shelter cap, the way SNAP works is that it's a math game. It's expenses, it's income, and then deductions, and so on. Really wanted to highlight that currently that there's a shelter cap unless you are over 60 or have a disability. Individuals, particularly working women, are not allowed to claim their food shelter costs. They only get to claim $597, regardless if their rent is $2,500 or even more. So this is especially harmful for families who live in areas with higher costs of living, which, as we have seen during the pandemic, it has spread all across the country. We know, for example, that in 2019, over 2 million or 14% of SNAP households in the US hit the shelter cap and were shortchanged. In the states with some of the highest rent costs or high unhoused individuals, in Vermont and California, the percentage of households who hit the cap was nearly double the national rate. And why this would be important is because we know that income from, if you look at a quick example, we know that if people were able to claim their actual shelter costs, that will mean a bump into their SNAP benefits, allowing them to have better benefit adequacy. And this is particularly important because the shelter cap reinforces racial injustice. We know because of redlining and a federal history of the way they have done housing, that nationally rental costs for Black and Latina or Latinas or Latinx households are higher than costs for white households. So definitely advocating for priorities that we're able to help this. I wanted to speak briefly about eliminating time limits, like Omaila said, started in 1996. And we want to clarify that even President Clinton, as he was signing this, expressed severe concerns about provisions of this legislation that failed to provide, as it was called at the time, food stamps, support to childless adults who wanted to work but couldn't find a job. And that's really the key. These time limits do not come with, here's a job offer or here's transportation. We're going to help you. And they're not giving the opportunity to participate in a work program. As Amalia said, people can only get 3 months within a 3-year period, so I will skip that. And you will have in the slides, if you want to take a closer look, just the deep harm of time limits. And what we said, it doesn't come with a job. It doesn't come with, in many places, the resources. And states don't have the obligation to do much or offer skill trainings, employment services, or transportation assistance before cutting food assistance. I did want to spend a little bit of a second so that we understand just what this harm means, right? With the end of the public health emergency, with the passage of the debt ceiling, meaning that this month, the time limits went into effect. So 3 months, August, September, October, we're going to see people, as people are even more hungry, being cut off. And then beginning September this month, the age limit expanded from 49 now to 50-year-olds. And then next month is going to expand to 51, 52-year-olds. And by next year, it'll be 53 and 54. Yes, there are some new temporary explicit exemptions to the time limits, but we're highly concerned on how they're going to be applied and how this is great, but it's incredibly difficult to apply this. And our disability community is a perfect example of that. Even though people may be eligible for these exemptions, many of them have fallen through the cracks because of the burdensome paperwork requirement that Omaila went over with. Just wanted to show that when a sample of when time limits when reimposed, we saw that what it does, it just caseloads go down, but it doesn't mean the hunger goes down. It means more people are hungry and they're reutilizing more local food sources that they may not be able to access. I wanted to finish this part with time limits with this, that even among those who had jobs in July of this year, 4 million were part-time for economic reasons. This particular rule requires 20 hours. So you're at 19.5, the commuting time doesn't cover this, is not part of this. And part of them, half of these people who are in this gig economy or part-time were women. And as the Bureau of Labor Statistics explained, these individuals who would have preferred full-time employment were working part-time because their hours had been reduced or they were unable to find full-time jobs. So this is really important as we hear this false narrative of saying, well, there's all these jobs, how come people don't want to get there? People are looking for a job and they would prefer this. But we need to talk about good places of employment, living wages, transportations, access, benefits, and what's preventing people from accessing these resources. We have various resources that we have put in here for you so that you can learn more about how incredibly harmful this is, including a fact sheet that we work with National Women's Law Center on how this is a gender equity issue among all signs, and the time limits need to be, they need to be eliminated. Lastly, just wanted to talk briefly about getting rid of the time limits for college students. It's a terrible rule that was in place, and by really pushing and getting rid of those in the Farm Bill, it will help many first generation, many low income women, LGBTQI+, because we know that this particular populations have a high rate of food insecurity, and it prevents them from being able to finish education. We do have an action step. I know Alyssa's going to talk more about that, but we have a sign-on letter where we're hoping that individuals and organizations will sign on and join the National Urban League and Unidos and us, and calling Congress to prioritize America's workforce and get rid of these time limits so that students don't have to choose between food and being able to finish school. We have various resources that you can help you as you're doing this advocacy and as you're learning more. The last thing I'll say is, as we think about the Farm Bill and this resources, public attitudes do not necessarily match what Capitol Hill does. Public attitudes actually support strengthening SNAP, making it better, and are against time limits. And that's across all parties, where 67% have a favorable view of SNAP. And that, over half want to make sure that SNAP eligibility requirements are less strict. Save the Children recently did a polling result that showed that voters are adamant the SNAP benefits were too low and should be increased. And again, this is across all party lines. The belief held across parties to groups, 80% Democrats, 63% independents, and 53% Republicans say that benefits should be increased. Again, additional polling showing that there's a strong support to make this farm bill strong and to support families that are struggling during high inflation. We learned that food costs rose, the food inflation, for almost 17%. That is more than has in previous years. They usually increase 3%. So families, food is more expensive, shelter is more expensive, childcare is more expensive, and all the benefits that were put in place and the resources to help people during a pandemic are gone, which is why we're facing this huge hunger cliff. So as we said, one of the ways that if we want to push for gender equity and racial equity, really pushing the Farm Bill and these main priorities will be pivotal in order to help eliminate some of these inequities and help stop hunger. And I'll turn it over to Alyssa.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. So next we're going to hear from Dorian Mason from National Women's Law Center.
Okay, sorry about that. I had to work on getting my webcam on. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to talk briefly today about how the Farm Bill could improve the health and well-being of women and girls. First and most apparent is how improved access to nutritional support impacts health. We know that food insecurity increases the risk of negative physical and mental health outcomes, with acute harm disproportionately falling on women of color, LGBTQ individuals, and people living at the intersection of those identities. Food insecurity has harmful impacts on physical health, including increases in the prevalence and severity of diet-related disease, such as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, obesity, stroke, and some cancers. This exacerbates the heightened risk women, and particularly women of color, have for contracting these diseases. And of course, these health consequences have a cost, a literal financial cost, and of course, a cost to the individual's health. In addition, because of limited financial resources, as was discussed earlier in the presentation, those who are food insecure may attempt to stretch budgets by using strategies that can be harmful to their health, such as underusing or postponing medication because of cost, postponing or forgoing preventive care or other needed care, and forgoing the foods needed potentially for special medical diets. Not surprisingly, research shows that household food insecurity is a strong predictor of increased numbers of emergency department visits and hospitalization and increased healthcare costs. So, research demonstrates SNAP decreases food insecurity and also, of course, healthcare utilization and costs. SNAP also impacts mental health and well-being. It helps to reduce stress for struggling families and families just generally worried about finances, and stress is highly correlated with poor health outcomes. Research demonstrates that SNAP helps to ensure infants and toddlers meet developmental milestones and help improve children's performance in elementary school and beyond. So access to SNAP benefits matter for mental and physical health and well-being of women and girls. But the Farm Bill also provides an opportunity to shore up a pipeline to access to healthy foods. It's not enough to acknowledge how important food security is to health and well-being. We have to ensure that the infrastructure is adequate to meet the needs. That's paramount. As detailed by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, a key to strengthening that pipeline is to dismantle the racism that's built into so much of our agricultural systems, including restructuring commodity, crop insurance and credit programs, reversing consolidation, and removing barriers to farmer adoption of soil and resource stewardship. The Farm Bill also provides an opportunity to support the mental health and well-being of farmers through the Farm and Stress Assistance Network. This program provides stress assistance to individuals who are engaged in farming, ranching, and other agricultural related occupations. And as we just discussed, comprehensive infrastructure is necessary to support access to healthy foods. And a big part of that is taking the health and well-being of those engaged in that work into consideration, especially those who are underrepresented and or under-resourced. And finally, the Farm Bill affords the opportunity to address the needs of pregnant and postpartum women. The Community Facilities Program offers direct loans, loan guarantees, and grants to develop or improve essential public services and facilities in communities across rural America. These amenities help increase the competitiveness of rural communities and also provide services for the residents. This funding could be applied specifically to rural hospitals for maternal health and maternal telehealth services. The Farm Bill could also create a grant program for healthy foods and clean water for pregnant and postpartum women, aiming to deliver healthy food, infant formula, clean water, and diapers to people in food deserts. Ultimately, there are many ways the Farm Bill can help promote and support the health and well-being of women, and we look forward to working with you to ensure that all those provisions are included. Thank you.
I think you're muted, Alyssa.
I'm sorry about that, guys. I was just very briefly saying that the next speaker is going to be Whitney Pasek from National Women's Law Center. And then after Whitney, we're going to do some Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can drop it into the Q&A box or in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, no problem at all. As you said, I'm Whitney. I'm the Director of Federal Child Care Policy at the National Women's Law Center, and I appreciate you joining us all this afternoon. I'm just going to talk briefly about how the Farm Bill represents an opportunity to advance family economic security, as well as support child development through improving access to child care. Needless to say, child care is a critical issue for families across the country, particularly those in low-income households and in rural areas. Access to childcare can be a determining factor in a family's ability to work, pursue an education, and provide for their children. Already, much of the country is what we call a childcare desert, where there are more than 3 children under the age of 5 for every licensed childcare spot available. But in rural America, home to about 2 million farms, those issues are amplified. Rural families are more likely to live in a childcare desert than in suburban or urban areas, and they're also likely to pay more for childcare than in suburban or urban areas. And it's also that farm workers face kind of unique circumstances when it comes to accessing and affording childcare. As folks, I'm sure that have been following closely know, there's a growing number of women-owned farms in this country. So there's a greater need for there to be childcare. As we know, childcare often falls on the shoulders of women. And in heterosexual relationships, it's found that more and more that it's both people are needed to operate the farm, as well as have some off-farm jobs in order to make ends meet. 3/4 of farm families reported difficulty finding and affording childcare, and women were twice as likely as men to report childcare was an important factor in farm decisions. Farm work also doesn't follow the traditional 9 to 5 workday, and so childcare needs to be really flexible and available during evening and weekend hours so that farmers can complete their work. And also in rural America, many families have to drive long distances to access childcare. And it's also really important that childcare be available to farming families, because farm work is really dangerous for children. And the idea that, children can just be, cared for by their parents as they're doing the work is not what's most safe for the children. And additionally, childcare is under additional strain right now because of the American Rescue Plan emergency funding that was passed by Congress is expiring at the end of this month. So childcare subsidies are going to be even more stretched very soon. What's unique about this year's Farm Bill is that it's the first time that the American Farm Bureau and the National Farmers Union have made childcare one of their priorities in the 2023 Farm Bill. And as a result, there's been a bipartisan bill known as the Expanding Childcare in Rural America, or ECRA Act of 2023. And it's linked to the Farm Bill, and it seeks to provide funding for the establishment and maintenance of childcare centers in rural communities. It is seeking to improve the availability and quality and cost of childcare, and it accomplishes this through a mix of grant and loan programs under the Consolidated Farm and Rural Development Act. It's giving priority to applicants from farming-dependent counties, and a balanced geographical distribution of funding is mandated. So applicants can include childcare providers or intermediaries, such as a referral organization, a staffed family childcare network, or nonprofits with demonstrable expertise in providing or developing childcare programs, facilities, or funding. While this proposal doesn't introduce any new money, and it obviously won't solve the childcare crisis affecting the nation overall, but any programs, nonprofits, or businesses that want to address the lack of childcare in rural parts of the country could apply to tap into this money. It could help build new centers, expand existing ones, or improve care. It also helps give the USDA a blueprint for childcare initiatives, allowing individual communities to respond to unique needs. So the National Women's Law Center has endorsed the ECRA Act and believes that the Farm Bill should prioritize its inclusion in the 2023 Farm Bill. Thank you so much, Alyssa. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. So we are going to move over to our Q&A right now. And for our folks on our panel, I'm going to just read the question, and then any of you guys can popcorn in with the answers. Any sort of links that you want to do, you can drop those into the chat too. So the first question we got was, do we have good data on how many LGBTQ plus parents specifically benefit from SNAP or WIC?
So I don't know if Melissa or Sarah wants to jump in, but like I said, the way the one organization, which is FNS, which is responsible for tracking this data, doesn't have that as a category. I mean, they still have households as determined by a male and female. So this is work that really needs to be done. They quantify race and gender, but this isn't yet one of their categories. So Sarah, feel free to jump in and correct me.
Sure. And I posted the link to our by the numbers brief in the Q&A, and I think in the chat as well. But because FNS doesn't collect it, we have to try to find data through other methods. So our improving nutrition section of our by the numbers brief is on page 4. So you can find some data there about, I believe it's 2020 data about LGBTQ women and non-binary folks and their participation in SNAP. But a lot of the sort of non-governmental surveys that capture this data seem to be better about reporting percentages of demographics participating in SNAP rather than the number of participants in a given demographic. That's really where I think FNS data is better, but lacking for the LGBTQ plus population.
Great, thank you. Did anyone else have anything else they wanted to add to this? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. So someone asked, how well does the new Farm Bill require healthier SNAP food?
Well, one of the beautiful things about SNAP is the dignity of choice. It's really important of who's defining healthy, right? Is it the Western culture, like who's making this definition without taking care of culture or accessibility. We do know for a fact that individuals were able to increase their nutrition intake with the higher supplemental benefits, right? So higher increase. It's a matter of resources. We also have data that shows that individuals on SNAP are less likely to visit the ER, have less pharmaceutical costs. So we know that as a whole, and we also know that it's very important to know that there is no difference between an individual who is on SNAP and another individual who's not on SNAP's food cart, right? So we need to be careful, like as we think of asking those questions and treating individuals who have on SNAP differently than other individuals utilizing the mode of tender. And I saw Umaila come out of her camera's on, so she might want to add something to that.
Yeah, the one thing I just want to point out is that right now, while we did have the Thrifty Food Plan adjustment, that we make it clear that SNAP benefits really fall short of what families need in order to put healthy food on the table. So there's obviously, we all know there's a huge body of research emphasizing the importance of things like nutritious foods and eating a range of foods that are often more costly, like more whole grains, vegetables, lean proteins. But in order to purchase that food and also prepare healthy meals, families need to have enough money to not just buy the ingredients, but they need the time to buy and prepare the meals, the facilities to prepare meals. And when it comes to hardworking low-income families who are often working multiple jobs just to make ends meet and put food on the table, sometimes they lack the money, the time, the spaces that are required for those healthy meals, or what we envision sometimes as healthy meals. So it's just really clear to reiterate that benefits for most families aren't enough to get them through the month without going hungry or being forced to sacrifice the nutritional quality of the food that they're buying with their benefits.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on to the next question. I think this is a clarifying question for Whitney. So someone was a little bit confused about the statement that there'll be no new money for rural childcare. So they're asking, how can the new provision on childcare help without funding?
That's a really good question. And it's actually really unfortunate because when the bill was first being talked about, there was going to be a 10% set aside for childcare in that grant program. But due to some last minute negotiations, that piece was pulled out. And so there's no longer a set aside. So, I mean, this really is more just, I think, a step forward in like messaging and in raising the urgency of prioritizing childcare in rural America and the tie to farm work in that those, large, farm groups are raising childcare as an issue, and that, bipartisan members of Congress see that there's a need to address it. But it's unfortunate that it has, fallen victim to most, of our childcare pushes, where it has become really divisive when it comes to actually investing money into these programs. So it really is just about, increasing the prioritization of childcare in the Farm Bill, and for the grants and contracts that childcare services are eligible for. But that's a really good question, and happy to chat more about what's needed for childcare offline. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the next question says, I know you can't predict the future, but how will a government shutdown affect benefits like SNAP?
We can look back as to previous shutdowns, right? We can look at 2019, we can look at 2015, and what happens is that states operate differently. So this is a federal program, but states operate differently, and they have to send their guidance to their particular processor and say, we're going to issue benefits for October. If there's a shutdown and that order has not been given, many states may not be able to issue that order. There's some states who will say, it's okay, we might not get federal funding, we'll pay out of our state budget, it's fine. But we know not every state has that flexibility. We know that some states did better than others during the last shutdown, but no state did well. So yeah, there's actually, I will share that as a follow-up. We know that California tracked the harm of the last shutdown and what it had for individuals. So it could be really harmful. So it's important that the federal government issues the guidance and what to do in case this does happen, so that states can better prepare, and also sending the message to clients, because that's who suffers, is low-income individuals who will not know if they're going to have this, and the anxiety, because for many of them, this is what helps them to be able to say, I can pay the rent, I can pay what I need. So it's very concerning, not knowing what's going to happen and being sort of in a limbo.
I will also add that depending on the length of the shutdown, it could impact things like new people applying to SNAP or WIC or other benefits. So if the people are not in the office, they won't be able to process new clients basically to the program, and have them go through, like the computer programs and input. So that could delay how long new people are able to get benefits as well. Okay, I think we have time for at least one or two more questions. So someone wanted to know, would there be any specific barriers or challenges that would make it harder for LGBTQ plus individuals to qualify for or apply for SNAP and similar benefits?
So I'll invite Sarah as well, and I'll give you the book answer. There shouldn't be, but I always say that, again, it's a federal program, but each state will administer differently, and each state may make it easier, right? Like, so an online application, having separate boxes, and other states just may require just specific in-person or require additional barriers, right? If we think about some of our youth who are the LGBTQI plus, who live on their own, right? Like, are they young house? How do they prove that? The addresses, there's some, in addition to that, just the burdensome administrative requirements are very lengthy. And I would not just say, I would say across populations, but these populations are pretty unique. I'll let you fill in additional barriers.
Sure, thanks. Yes, and I put this in the Q&A section. We are, confession, in the midst of updating this issue brief with FRAC. Thank you very much. But our 2021 version that I put in the Q&A has some information on this, including different policies on IDs. Can certainly be a barrier for trans and non-binary individuals. Anti-LGBTQ plus bias, which we hope no employee related to the SNAP application process is dealing with, but there's always room for improvement in non-bias training. And yes, if you have additional suggestions, I very much welcome them. I will put my email in the chat, but as we're updating this issue brief, we'd love to hear about other barriers folks are aware of. Thank you.
Great. And I'm just going to ask one more question to the group, and then we'll move on to some action steps. So hopefully we can keep the answer to this one quick, but it is an important one. So we're being asked to use our crystal ball to guess what the timeline for the Farm Bill will be. Is it a short CR? Are we looking at a one-year extension, pushing it to next year? They want to know for campaign purposes what we potentially think this could look like as we stand here on September 14th.
Well, I'm going to ask all of my colleagues to pull out their crystal ball because we're all in the same boat. I will say that, right now the main focus has been agri-probes and making sure there's no shutdown, right? If there is a shutdown, that means that USDA can offer TA assistance in the bill language, right? Like if they're thinking of putting certain sections. So just sort of keep that in mind. Some of the things that we heard is, Ms. Stabenow said that she's confident that maybe we can get it by the end of this year. We know that Mr. Bozeman really also likes working with Ms. Stabenow. So, if we're looking at like worst case scenario, ideally no more than the first quarter of next year. But in terms of campaign and advocacy, I definitely at the writing stages, the drafting stages are the most important, which is like protect it, strengthen it. Look what's going on with our economy and with human and with the people that it's impacting. Don't touch SNAP. Alyssa, I don't know if you want to add something else to that, but we're all in the same thing.
Yeah. I think you need to look at a couple things like legacy issues when it comes to Senator Stabenow, who will not be running for re-election. that the chairs tend to want this to be bipartisan, but they're dealing with their larger caucus, which could push it into the next year. And I will quickly say that depending on where this is going, say come November, early December, there is a chance that advocates like us will want to push for a long-term CR. Like there is a world where if we think it's going to be major cuts to SNAP or major changes, that the existing law that we have and the existing bill that we have, just continuing that versus having something that could be detrimental to the program and to impacted families, you might not want a farm bill. You might just want like a long-term CR. So I think a lot of that will be, something that we'll see over the next couple of months. So thank you all for all of your questions. I want to switch now quickly to ways to take action, because now you've been given all this great information, and the organizer in me always likes to say, now what are you going to do with that information? So there are a couple of different ways that we are asking you to take action, and there's a couple of different options, and I'll ask my colleagues also to kind of jump into the chat with their pieces. But obviously, you can contact your members of Congress. You can activate, if you have an organization with a membership or a field of any sort, you can have them contact their members of Congress. Both the Senate and the House are important in this instance. And you could ask them very simple messages like protect SNAP. You could ask them to include child care provisions in the Farm Bill, like Whitney talked about. Moms Rising has a letter, a petition letter that folks can sign on to. You also can use this language to, feel free to like copy this language and use it for your own purposes. The link into the chat. And if others have action pages as well, you should feel free to drop those into the chat for your organization. The other really important piece is to talk about stories, right? To show like the real families, the real impact, especially since we're talking about this from a racial and gender justice lens, to talk about the impacted communities, families, and individuals with the Farm Bill. And so we include people to find various ways to share their stories. It could be just calling your member of Congress and talking about how SNAP helps your family or has lifted up your family. In the past, you can use this in a social media way by tweeting directly at your member of Congress or posting to Instagram and tagging them. There's lots of ways to share your story. You could do this in meetings. Moms Rising also has a story collection page that we use that I will drop into the chat now. And I will also share with you a link to a storybook that we have created to show you how we use our stories. But we encourage you to definitely share your stories in various ways. And then I know, Sarah, did you want to jump in to talk about the gender justice sign-on letter for organizations?
Sure. So some of you may have already received this, but we have a gender justice sign-on letter that includes asks related to strengthening SNAP, but also the childcare and healthcare pieces. And we sent a version with, I believe, over 250 organizations to the Hill in August. And there is no House Farm Bill text circulated yet. So we are reopening the sign-on letter to hope that we can send another iteration in the next couple of weeks or so. Maybe we can get closer to 400 organizations with your help. And you can sign on if you're a national, state, or local organization.
And I know that we're getting some questions if you'll be receiving any materials afterwards. We will send a copy of this recording along with the captions and some additional materials after the webinar ends. So you can use that and feel free to share it with your network as well, or any colleagues that weren't able to attend. So we're almost up to the hour. So I just want to thank all of you for coming, engaging on this issue. It's such an important fight. And we hope that you will stay engaged and stay in touch and figure out different ways to take action as this process moves forward. So thank you so much for joining the webinar today.